Welcome to the 8th lecture of the Spring 2016 Baumer Lecture Series at the Knowlton School. My name is Andrew Cruz. I'm an assistant professor of architecture and chair of this year's series. Tonight I'm pleased to introduce Mahadev Raman, a practicing mechanical engineer, director at ARUP Group, director at ARUP University, and faculty at the Princeton School of Architecture. Many aspects of Mahadev's professional and academic work demonstrate an ambition to cultivate collaborative ties between the fields of architecture and engineering as part of designing challenging and innovative projects. This is an ambition we at the Knowlton School are well suited to share, given that the school sits within the College of Engineering and is known for its rigorous design education. I say this is the 8th lecture of the spring, but in another sense it is the 3rd lecture in a series of similar talks from cutting-edge mechanical engineers who collaborate with architects. This started with Forrest Meagers, also from Princeton last spring, followed by Eric Olson of Transolar last fall. As director at ARUP, Mahadev represents an important contribution and continuation of the themes addressed in these previous talks. ARUP, where Mahadev has been since 1978, is one of a handful of elite global engineering firms whose work is synonymous with collaboration, exploration, and innovation. Ove ARUP, the Danish-English founder, was a structural engineer who rose to international prominence by figuring out how to build the shelves of the Sydney Opera House in collaboration with the architect Jorn Utzon. The structural innovation in signature buildings continues as a key legacy of the firm, perhaps most recently with Cecil Baumann's work with OMA on the CCTV building in Beijing. Among engineering specialties, structural engineering has the most immediate affinity with architectural design, since both the architect and the structural engineer are directly involved in the visual appearance of the building. Mahadev, as I mentioned, is a mechanical engineer. As such, his specialty is the air around buildings, literally their atmosphere, and the physics that govern it. Given that this atmosphere is largely invisible, its direct relevance to architectural form is less obvious, but perhaps more interesting, for 2 reasons. First, recognizing what's in the air is a design challenge. Apart from a few notable exceptions within the modern architectural canon, think of Frank Lloyd Wright's Inglenook's or Le Corbusier's Brise Soleil, architects have not produced many compelling examples of an atmospheric, formal, spatial matrices that fully integrate the intangible and effervescent qualities of atmosphere. This, however, may be changing. Second, addressing the atmosphere and the related issues of energy and carbon are at the heart of the great drama of our time, that is climate change and the unpredictable atmospheres that it produces. Being a practical and poetic advocate for the building atmosphere and the physics of the environment is a task ideally suited to a firm like ARUP and to people like Mahadev. In 1969, Ove ARUP summarized the ethos of the firm he had founded 33 years earlier in an article entitled Aims and Means. There he wrote, quote, "In any work we undertake, we must try by diplomacy, by persuasion, and by, if necessary, gratuitously overstepping our brief, to counteract the sometimes absurd effects of multiple design responsibilities. We must be more and more concerned with informing and advising the client, because the right decision on what to build is usually much more important than how to build it." Mahadev's portfolio exemplifies both this expanded idea of an architectural project and the open spirit of collaboration necessary to bring such projects to fruition. Starting as a young engineer at ARUP in the late 70s, Mahadev worked on Richard Rogers' high-tech icon, the Lloyds of London, where the aesthetics of mechanical engineering can lead us to forget that it had an extremely aggressive energy budget for its day. While more recent projects include Richard Meyer's Jubilee Church in Rome, where the building's comfort comes from its material and formal qualities, instead of from dedicated bits of technology. Along the way, he has worked with Raymond Abraham on the Austrian Cultural Forum in New York, Stephen Hall on Simmons Hall at MIT and the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, and Diller and Sgraffito at the ICA in Boston. Tonight, we can look forward to seeing more of this provocative and memorable work from a man and a firm whose role is instrumental in making it that way. Please join me in welcoming Mahadev Raman.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for that gracious introduction. I actually came today with two different talks that I could have given, and one would have been a fitting sequel to the introduction, because it was basically a chronology of all the things that I've done through my 30-something year career and so on. The other is really something that doesn't focus so much on my own personal work, but really tries to educate us as architects and engineers on the challenges that lie ahead of us with regard to carbon in particular and climate change, and the need to design buildings that draw as little as possible on environmental resources. So I decided, perhaps wrongly, to focus on that second topic. But at the end, if you have questions on the portfolio of projects that was just mentioned, I'd be very happy to talk about that as well. But I'm going to launch into the net zero design talk rather than the historical overview. So, meeting the carbon challenge. It is really a challenge, and there's a lot of high-level talk about this, most recently at COP21, with plenty of ambitious goals that are put out there as to where we must get to. I don't think there's, other than in some political venues, there isn't much argument about where we need to get to, but there is really very little guidance on how we get there. And that's what I would really like to focus my talk on today. So first, a little bit of background. I don't know if you've seen this image before, but it was something that was put together, certainly the main part of it was put together by the European Space Agency a number of years ago. And it's just to give us a sense of scale about the environment that we're dealing with. So clearly, these two are images of the world. But those other little spheres on there have an important significance. If you collected together all of the water that exists on the planet's surface, the seawater, the fresh water, and everything, and put it together into a sphere, that's what you get over there, just to give you a sense of scale. That's all that there is. If you did the same with the atmosphere, you get that pinkish sphere over there. And to look at some of the others, let me just zoom in a little bit on there. So the Earth's diameter, 12,700 kilometers. That's the atmosphere. There's the hydrosphere on the left. The fresh water is that the blue sphere here. There's only that much of it available. The available freshwater, and by available I mean freshwater that's actually accessible by human beings for all of our activities, is an even smaller quantity. And you might be wondering what the little red dot is at the top. That's all of the fossil fuels that have ever existed. Okay, and we don't necessarily get a sense of scale about these different aspects of our environment. The Earth seems so vast, but essentially we occupy this little thin layer on its surface, which consists of the hydrosphere, the land, the atmosphere, etc. And so with this kind of perspective, it's much more understandable how human activity can actually lead to the pollution and the destabilizing of this fragile environment. So these are graphs that you've probably seen a million times, and I'm sorry to put them up there again, but it is an important point that if you look at measurements of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you might ask, how did we have measurements back then? Well, those measurements were derived from ice core samples in the Antarctic and so on. So it tells a clear story that carbon dioxide levels have stayed fairly low for a long time, and then with the start of the Industrial Revolution and initially the exploitation of coal and then oil, there's been a dramatic increase in carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, which recently, 2 years ago, just topped 400 parts per million for the very first time. So clearly there's something happening. And a much less talked about issue is the level of methane in the atmosphere. Now these figures, the ones for carbon dioxide are parts per million, the figures for methane are parts per billion. But methane is something like 10 to 20 times more active as a greenhouse gas in the environment. And we've been releasing lots of methane as well. And the main source of that is actually factory farming. So there is so much meat production taking place today that the methane output from all of those animals is creating measurable increases in methane in the atmosphere. Okay. And carbon dioxide emissions from mankind, currently at about 34 billion metric tons per year, and that works out to about 5 tons per person on average, but all of us in the US actually emit on average 17 tons per person. So we're using about 3 times the global average, or we're emitting about 3 times the global average. And of course, this last number on here is subject to all sorts of discussion, but there's growing consensus that the sustainable level of emissions, in other words, emissions that the environment can actually absorb on an ongoing basis, would really be closer to 2.5 metric tons per person, rather than the 17 that we're emitting right now. So there's a huge challenge there. And all of this is known. Come back to the question, so what are we to do about it, particularly as professionals engaged in the building trades? I'll skip through these. These are just the various suggestions as to what might happen with global temperature, depending on the level of carbon dioxide. The scientists are urging us to follow the green curve down and to not let atmospheric carbon exceed 450 parts per million. And they say that if we actually get to 1,000 parts per million, the global temperature on average will go up by 6 degrees with all sorts of catastrophic consequences. So again, it's fairly scary as a picture. Are we actually able to do anything about it? So to try and get a handle on that, let's first look at what is happening in the US, this is specifically, with regard to carbon emissions. So you can see from this chart, this is all of the emissions that are produced by the economy. 21% of carbon emissions are actually produced by residential buildings. It is much more than the commercial buildings, which are all the institutional, educational, office buildings, etc. They emit about 18%, and residential emissions are 21%. So in total, about 40% of the emissions are actually due to buildings. And if we were to look at what we need to do to this, other countries are a little bit ahead of us. So this is a chart that was produced by the UK government, where actually, interestingly, in the UK, their residential sector is much more than the rest. So 2/3 of their emissions come from residential and 1/3 from all of the other types of buildings. They plotted out this future curve as to how they would like their emissions to go down over time to meet the 2050 targets at the end there. So it's all very well to draw a curve like that. How do you go about doing anything about this? So what does it really mean to us? So that's what I did a little bit of research on. And the first thing is to say, well, okay, what sort of trajectory makes sense for America? Now, there was a time when the Obama administration was trying to put an energy bill through Congress. It didn't actually get there. So looking around, there are a few city jurisdictions that have actually set themselves targets. And Seattle seems to be the one that's most sort of aggressively going after carbon reductions within the city. And so I applied, go back. I applied the sorts of reduction scenarios that they had in mind to the whole of the American economy, and that's the kind of profile you get coming out of it. Which, does that mean anything? Not necessarily. The important parts of that profile are the starting point, which is where we are now, and where we need to get to. And obviously, the sooner we can get there, the less impact we'll have on the environment along the way. But one of the things that we have to take into account is that buildings actually change over on a very slow life cycle. So if you think about the American population, it's predicted to exceed 400 million by the time you get to 2050. I think it's about 450 million is the prediction. All of those additional people are going to need space to live in and so on. And I would suggest that the total quantity of buildings or built space in 2050 will be about 1.4 times what we have today. At the same time, buildings are renovated to some extent, but they have very long life cycles. And another estimate suggests that in 2050, 70% of the buildings that are around today will still be around in 2050. And they will make up about half of the building stock in 2050. So these are all of the relatively poorly performing buildings that we have today that are emitting carbon at a particular rate. And this dotted line here represents the emissions from 70% of existing buildings. And if we were to do nothing about those buildings between now and 2050, and they kept producing carbon at the same rate, we already have a level of emissions here which is significantly larger than the target that everyone says we need to get to. So that's the first challenge. Now, what about new buildings? I said that half the buildings that are around in 2050 will be new and half existing. So if the buildings in the future, everything that we're doing from now on to 2050 would perform the same on average as the buildings we have today, that's how much emission we would have in total. However, if we were to really work hard at this, starting right now, and we were to make our new buildings as efficient as they could be, we still don't actually get quite to zero with the new building stock, but we can argue that the new buildings could emit something like 15% of what a code-compliant building or what an average building today emits. So you could say that this amount of emission, which we haven't started giving off yet, could become this with appropriate practice by the building industry, the architects, engineers, etc. And if you look at the existing building stock, there are various UN studies that suggest that we could actually reduce those to about 50% of what they consume today, realistically, without knocking them down and building them again. So, with a following wind, in other words, everyone does the best that they can from now going forwards to both address new buildings and to address the existing building stock, where would our emissions be by 2050? They are still significantly above, in fact, 3 times what the scientists are telling us we need to get to. So, on the one hand, that's a sobering conclusion. And there are no signs, frankly, immediately that we are doing things to make our buildings that much better. Even if you look at the latest LEED standard, which is LEED 4, it's just come out, and in fact, it's so stringent that people have been given a moratorium, and you don't need to. You can go back to the old LEED standard for a few more years before the new one comes in. But even the new LEED standard doesn't actually achieve the level of performance that's implied by this reduction in emissions. So a lot of people are trying. The thing is, it doesn't look as if it's enough at the moment. Now, how does one bridge this gap? The answer to that really is by having a much larger portfolio of renewable energy, both supplying the grid and built into our buildings as we go forwards. So that, if you like, is setting the scene for what I want to talk about now, which is really the design of net zero buildings. I hope you will see from this that it's important and that we should push hard. Thank you for the quote from ARUP. I think that that was actually very appropriate for this. What he was saying essentially is, don't just do as you're told, push a little harder, try and get a better result. And I think that we, each of us, have a responsibility in practice to do that. So the concept of net zero buildings isn't new. This facility here is at least 15 years old, if not 20. Now, I have visited it. Frankly, I wouldn't want to live in a place like that, but it is one of those live-work environments where those buildings are all designed to be very low energy to start off with, and then they have solar panels and other means whereby their emissions are minimized. It's got a boiler that's fed off biomass, so it's wood chips, and that's a sort of carbon-intensive way of creating heating. So why am I showing you a building that's 20 years old? Frankly, if you look out there, there aren't that many buildings that would meet the standard for net zero. There just haven't been so many. I've got a few more coming down the line that I'll show you. The other question is that people often get caught up on, well, what does net zero really mean? And then there are all of these different types of definitions. Oh, I keep doing that, sorry. All of these different types of definitions for what net zero means. Frankly, we're so far away from actually doing any of this that I think we should stop worrying about the sort of fine academic definitions of what net zero really means, and just get on with it. And the simple definition that I think will work for most of our purposes is to say that a building over an annual cycle generates as much energy as it consumes over that annual cycle. If we could get just to that point, I think that we'd be doing an enormous amount to actually help reduce our emissions as a society. Also, just be a little careful that net zero energy and net zero carbon are not quite the same thing, because if you're using the methodology that I just described, where you're generating electricity on site, say using a solar panel, that electricity is completely free of carbon. However, there will be months in the winter when you need to import energy from the grid, and that energy that you import will have a carbon footprint associated with it, even though you might be exporting an equivalent amount in the summer months. So you can get into all sorts of arguments about, are you really achieving zero carbon by using the grid as a big battery, because the assumption, you're assuming that there'll be availability of energy from the grid, which typically has a carbon content to it. But anyway, as I said before, I think that those are somewhat esoteric arguments, and we should just focus on making our buildings better as a first step. So what are the stages in doing a net zero building? I think these are pretty obvious. The first one is to reduce the loading in the building as much as possible. So in other words, reduce the problem that you have in terms of the need for energy-intensive systems in the design. Try and use passive systems as much as possible. I noticed all of the exposed concrete in this building, which would suggest that it actually works quite well as a passive building. I don't know if it plays out that way in reality, but anyway. That isn't the only way, obviously, of doing passive design, but passive design is a very important first step. And it's only after you've extracted all of the benefits of those two that you would then go on to looking at active systems, actually energy consuming HVAC systems, lighting, etc. And once you've done that, there's the whole issue of energy recovery. So if you've put in a system to achieve a certain condition within the building, it's consuming energy, but then it also has a waste stream of waste energy coming out of it. Can any of that be recovered and reused within the building? So that's the next step, step 4, if you like. And then the final step is to get to renewable energy generation. So once you've minimized your demand, you can then say, okay, so this is now my net demand. What do I have to do to generate on the building or on the site all of the energy that I need? Now, in all honesty, every design is not going to lend itself to be able to achieve the renewable energy on site. Many buildings are in constrained locations, they might be overlooked, overshadowed, et cetera, you may not be able to do what you need to. There are some pictures of buildings that I'll show you which have wind turbines built into the building. Frankly, I would never anymore recommend putting a wind turbine on a building, because I'm not aware of a single one that has actually worked successfully, including ones that I was involved in designing. So most of the time these wind turbines sit there still, and they look a little sorry, and it's a waste of money. So please don't put wind turbines on buildings. It's a waste of time. Okay, where was I with this? So if you can't do the renewable energy generation on site, the next step is to actually see if you can purchase green energy for the project. Now, some of these offsets and so on have been discredited because there isn't a proper audit trail to say that you are actually getting the green energy that you're paying for. But increasingly, even our utility companies here have set up processes whereby you pay a little premium, but you can be sure that they are purchasing green energy to match the amount that you're consuming in your facility. And I'm able to do that at home, for example. I don't live in a net zero building, I'm sorry to say, despite all the solar panels on the roof. Okay. So the sorts of measures that you can implement in the design, these are all pretty obvious, so I'll just flick through them pretty quickly. And what this points to is that you finally end up with a certain minimum amount of consumption for your building. It's very difficult to get to an actual zero consumption building. Perhaps a unconditioned bus shelter would be as close as you can get in that regard. So very often photovoltaics end up being the answer to make your building net zero. Now that has consequences, and you'll see a number of buildings that I show you where the photovoltaic array then starts to dominate the architecture. And this is something that you need to think about as architects. To me, it's fine. I look at the photovoltaic array and I say, great, we're generating clean energy here, but architecturally dealing with it can be quite a challenge. The other thing is the importance of scale. Actually, if you look at just the building itself, you'll find that the low-rise situation on the right here is much easier to deal with in terms of net zero. And also buildings at a domestic scale, it's not a big challenge at all to generate as much energy in the context of a single-family home to power all of the needs of the house. But when you get to the dense urban environments, that's where you have the real challenge. However, again, it's important to look at this thing in a holistic way, because usually when people are living in this type of an environment, there are all sorts of transportation costs and things that come in, and the use of transportation to get to facilities, to get to work, to commute, etc., adds up in terms of carbon. So we did do a study to see if we could quantify this. So we initially took a low-rise development in the suburbs of New Jersey as an example. So that's the graph on the left, and everything up here is to do with the building itself, and everything down here is to do with all of the consequential carbon in the fact that you have to get into a car to go shopping, et cetera, et cetera. And you add all of that up, And it was interesting to note that almost half the carbon is actually due to the transportation side as opposed to the building itself. So the first thing was what happens when you move that building to an urban setting, and immediately you get this dramatic drop in the carbon associated with transportation. Now, of course, this was a specific case study. If you change the parameters or do it for a different city, you might get slightly different results. But the point is that you do need to look at these situations holistically, and the fact that you've done this beautiful, self-contained, net zero building in the middle of nowhere doesn't suddenly mean it's the best thing that you could have done for the environment. Okay. Then all of these other stages here are different things that you could do to lighting, heating, cooling, etc., to reduce the energy even further. And this is about as far as we could get in this particular case in terms of the carbon emissions. But the main point to make there is that you need to draw the boundary a little wider than just the building itself when you're looking at these carbon accounting schemes. So this was an ambitious project that died as soon as the global financial crisis hit us. But prior to that, these developers in Florida actually wanted to build a city that holistically considered, with all of the transportation, et cetera, would achieve very low levels of carbon emissions. And we started off with the average in Florida, which is 16 tons per person. I told you the national average was 17. It's a little lower there because of the slightly more benign climate. Interestingly, you could make significant reductions just with density and land use strategies by encouraging walking and all of that in terms of the way in which the city was laid out. Transport modal share and capture rate. So this is how many of the trips can you capture with public transportation or have people do by themselves. Then energy demand reductions in the buildings themselves. So you can see that these two elements here are really more to do with transportation and urban design than they are to do with the individual buildings. And then you get down to the individual building reduction down here, and then your alternative energy supply, which is generating energy on site, which in Florida actually would work extremely well. It's interesting to note that the regulations in Florida actively discourage people from exploiting solar energy. Scary, but that's the case. And we were actually able to get this total. Of course, this is theoretical. This was never built. And the big challenge here is always to try and get what is actually built to match what you're designing or what your intentions are. But we showed that it was possible to get down to the 2.29 tons, which, if you remember from earlier on in the lecture, is more or less at the level that's considered to be sustainable. So what I draw from here is that it's not as if we're chasing something that's impossible, and we should actually be able to do a lot better than we're doing at the moment in terms of our carbon emissions. The issues are complex. The Treasure Island development in San Francisco also started off with very high ambitions, which ultimately were not met, mostly for economic reasons. But in studying that particular project, and I'm not going to explain this slide, it's just a way of showing you all of the different considerations that come into figuring out what the carbon footprint is of a development and what are all the different moves that you need to look at, to think about in order to achieve a better design. That was done fairly rigorously for this development. It's a real pity that it didn't proceed as planned, but it's still out there. It may yet happen. One of the things about the Treasure Island proposition was really looking at the energy profile, that the generation of energy on the site is given by the blue line there, and the consumption of energy is given by the yellow line. So this is where you export energy to the grid. These are the points where you're importing energy from the grid. And you can see from this chart that they don't quite balance out, but the idea in any net zero building is to make sure that those two peaks balance out. This is just a daily graph. There's also a seasonal graph that you have to overlay on this. And I know from my own solar installation at home that generally I'm in surplus through the summer months, and I'm in deficit through the winter months, and the shoulder seasons more or less balance out. Seems obvious, but that's where we are with that. So, are there examples of net zero buildings actually coming into the marketplace in a more ubiquitous way? There are in other countries. So there are various commercial house developers in the UK that actually offer you a net zero product. This is one of them. Barratt Homes, I think it is. Yes, Barratt Homes. And this is another one, the Lighthouse. I think this was more a demonstration project. Only one of these exists, as far as I know. They didn't then replicate it, although the design has been fully worked out. And this is the sort of wind turbines gone wild on the roof. Please don't do this. It's not worth the money. It doesn't do anything for you. Mind you, there may be some places that are particularly windy where a small-scale wind turbine would do something for you. But under those circumstances, you then have all sorts of other problems. They generate noise, they generate vibrations that go into the building. You then have to deal with all of those in the design of your building. And the best place for wind turbines is actually away from populated places, and the bigger they are in terms of diameter, the better they are in terms of efficiency. And also the bird life is able to deal with the bigger turbines more easily than with the smaller ones. So one of the big problems with wind farms is that you have a lot of bird hits on the blades, and then keeping them out of migratory paths and all of those things. That hasn't been considered enough, I would suggest, but the bigger turbines do better with those situations. Okay, also the impact of climate. There are many parts of the US where the climate is so benign that you could very easily, with careful design, actually achieve net zero. So this is the Renzo Piano building in San Francisco. It's very lean in terms of its energy requirements, but then it's in a place that helps you along with that. On the other hand, this project, sorry, I should replace this with an actual photograph of the building itself, Toshiko Mori's building in Syracuse. It's an extremely harsh climate. So to achieve a good level of performance here was so much more difficult given the Syracuse climate than it was in San Francisco. Now, regulations have an important part to play in all of this. There's one argument that says just leave it to economics. The market will take care of it, and as the consequences of carbon and so on become manifest in the marketplace, economics will drive you towards appropriate behavior. I don't buy that for 1 minute. I have a few examples from my own experience. So around 1999 or so, we were engaged by the United Nations to do a capital master plan for their entire site in New York. And a part of that was to really look at their energy consumption and emissions and so on within their facility. When we did the study, it turned out that those buildings, they were beautifully designed, I must say, as we went into the drawings and actually took apart the facade on the Secretariat building and so on. You could just see the care with which that whole complex of buildings was designed and constructed. But anyway, so we found that the energy consumption was ridiculously high. It was something like 4 or 5 times what a contemporary code-compliant building would consume. So obviously, anything we could do to reduce energy would be important for the future of the project and for the refurbishment. So one of the things that came up was, should we change the facade on the Secretariat building? It was a single glazed facade, so it had no real thermal value, and the glass was clear, although there had been various attempts at various times to put reflective films and things like that. They were never successful. So there was this facade. It was a real problem because there's a big east-facing facade that gets the morning sun, and then a huge west-facing facade that gets the evening sun, and the air conditioning loads within that building are just absolutely phenomenal. So you would think that upgrading that facade with high-performance glazing, double glazing, etc., would pay for itself with 25 years of energy savings. They gave us a 25-year horizon to justify the payback. Guess what? It didn't get anywhere close. And the facade was in such good condition that changing it for just because it was falling apart was not an issue. It would have easily lasted another 25 years. So those are the kinds of challenges when you talk about market forces. Market forces have done nothing to improve energy efficiency. The only way energy efficiency has gone up, the only reason why we put double glazing in our buildings is because the code mandates it, and in order to meet the code, you have to do certain things. It's not the market that drives you there. And a good example of that is this chart here. In California, immediately after the energy crisis, they actually brought in very strict energy codes in their buildings, this thing called Title 24 that has been ramped up year on year. And for many buildings, you actually have to submit your plans to be checked for Title 24. And you can, I did it again. All right. And you can see here that in California, if you take the kilowatt hours per capita of electricity consumption, it stayed pretty much constant from the mid-70s through to the present day with those regulations. If you look at the US as a whole, that's what's been happening in the country as a whole. And the only difference is that you have these strict regulations in California where they're focusing on energy consumption, they're implementing energy-saving measures in their vehicle fleets and buildings, etc., and that isn't being done everywhere else. So this isn't economics, it's pure policy at work. And at ARUP, we've got a research wing that actually helps authorities develop guidelines and so on for net zero buildings, amongst other things. That's just an example of those. So another trend is, of course, the whole ASHRAE code for energy conservation, ASHRAE standard 90.1. And this is just a graph showing how the requirements in that code have been ramped up year on year. And what usually happens is ASHRAE will produce a new version of their code. It'll be out there, people will look at it, and then various jurisdictions will start adopting it for use within their state. It usually happens at a state level, sometimes at a city level. So again, some jurisdictions are quicker with this and they'll adopt the latest code pretty quickly. Others are a bit lazy about it, and they'd still be referring to a code that's several generations old. So you might say that yes, your state energy code is based on ASHRAE 90.1. It's very important to ask the question, well, which version of this, which particular year is it based on? And the thing is that even with the most stringent standard today, which is quite hard to meet, we're still nowhere near getting close to something that would help us with our carbon emissions unless we also go the extra mile on the generation side to put in the energy generation. Now, ASHRAE as an energy code is basically limiting your consumption of energy in the building. Are there any codes out there that actually mandate the need for net zero buildings? Well, not in the US and not yet, but it's expected that US federal buildings will be required to be net zero by 2030. There's a plan for that. Will it come to pass? We don't know. 2030 is a long way away. But the United Kingdom, as of this year, is already requiring certain types of residential buildings to be net zero, and various European Union regulations are also coming in within the next few years. There was some talk of California residential buildings having to be net zero by starting from 2020. I don't quite know where that is at the moment. I don't have the latest information. But you can see that the US federal standard there is a regulation that's already in effect, but 2030 is a long way away, as I said. And these EU and UK regulations are also already in effect. So there is momentum building. The question is, can we do it quickly enough? But I would say that the speed at which we implement these things is less important than the effort we put in to just make a difference in every project that we're doing, to do more than just the bare minimum. So there are various predictions of market growth in net zero buildings. And you can see that the prediction in 2015 was pretty small, but for there to be a dramatic jump in net zero buildings, mainly driven by the European market. And we're beginning to see that happen already from our activities in Europe. In fact, when we got involved in the design of the US Embassy in London, the criterion for that building started off being net zero, that it would actually generate as much energy as it would consume. Interestingly enough, after 2 rounds of value engineering, it's back from that particular target, but nevertheless, it's doing a lot better than a simple code compliant building. So some more examples. Again, you'll find some of these are in climates that are much more benign. I don't want to take up too much time going through them in detail, but you can see the combination of passive and active means to achieve low energy performance. There's one example that I know of a net zero building in Hong Kong. This one recently opened. I don't have the actual photography for it, but again, you can see the dominant solar roof on the project, along with a bunch of other strategies, including the use of fans rather than air conditioning in some of the spaces. I'm actually surprised that outside of the domestic sphere, we don't use ceiling fans more in the buildings that we build here. We tend to go straight for the air conditioning. They are actually a very effective way of improving comfort, particularly in spaces where the comfort is not that critical. They can allow you to get rid of air conditioning, but create an environment that's much more pleasant than just sitting there in still air at that particular temperature. Just in case anyone decides to call me on this, a ceiling fan does not cool the air. It's just moving the air around, so it's giving you a perception of improved comfort rather than reducing the temperature within the space. But it can be effective in certain applications. Samsung putting efforts into developing these projects. This is also a project that opened recently in Massachusetts. It's a transit center, the first one in the country that's net zero. And you can well imagine that the roof is covered in solar panels. It is. And a courthouse as well. This is still in development. In this case, there are wind turbines as part of the project, but they're located on the site rather than on the building, which is a little better. Massachusetts is kind of on the edge as to whether wind turbines actually work there. So let's see how that goes. I've seen a few motionless wind turbines in the Boston area. And then there are buildings like this one, Croon Hall. In this case, we couldn't actually get the building to be net zero in of itself, but Yale decided that they would actually buy audited offsets to make up the energy that they couldn't generate on site with the solar panels that are on the roof. So it's net zero in an overall sense, but not in a site sense. And then this is PS62 on Staten Island. Again, notice the fact that the solar panels essentially take over, right? School of Business at Stanford, extensive solar panels all over the place. This is a challenge, right? These things are rectilinear, they're black, they come in certain module sizes. You need to face them a particular way for them to operate efficiently. It's a challenge for architects. And one particular building typology that you'll see coming up more and more, and I'm going to finish with some examples of these. The sort of the building underneath with a sort of solar canopy at the top, and creating a space underneath the canopy that can be used for various things, using the canopy for generating both energy as well as collecting water. That you'll see coming up more and more, and I have a couple more examples. So this is one we're doing in New York City. It's a project that started years ago, and it's still just chugging along. Meanwhile, there's this one in Acapulco that started much later, and it's nearing completion, actually. You can see the photograph there of it nearing completion. I'm perturbed to see that there are no solar panels on the grid that's up there. I hope that's because they just haven't installed them yet, and not that they've been value engineered out of the project, which would make a nonsense of this entire canopy structure up there, which was supposed to create shade and capture water in a semi-arid part of the country, etc. So one of the other problems at some of these buildings is that the generating facility actually becomes an important part of the architecture, and what happens if it's removed for some reason. The whole concept falls apart. Enrique Norton is the architect for this, by the way. And then this is a project I'm doing right now with Harry Cobb in Charleston. It's an African-American museum. Very ambitious goals in terms of energy for this one. So it has the solar panels on the roof. It has a geothermal system for generating cooling predominantly. There's not much of a heating demand in that part of the country. And yeah, I think that what is interesting about this one is to hear the architect in his terms talk about the importance of it being a net zero building. So it's, I think, a message to all of you that you need to figure out your own positions with regard to this, why you think it's important, why and how you're going to build it into your projects, and what you say about your projects. Right, and this is a bit of an aside here, really. A data center. So we all carry around these little devices, and we're extremely happy with the fact that you charge it up once a day, and it lets you do all this stuff throughout the day, and it seems to be extremely lean in terms of energy consumption, etc., etc. Underlying all that technology, you have monsters like this. This particular one is not so much of a monster because it was perhaps the first attempt at doing a green data center. There are some estimates that suggest that 2% of global carbon emissions are due to electricity consumption in data centers. So these things are not put in population centers. They're usually in the middle of nowhere, close to sources of power, or in environments where you can get cooling more easily or whatever, and they are huge energy hogs. And the whole sort of internet technology revolution is really built upon these things. And the traditional way of designing these was to basically sacrifice everything for the sake of reliability. So many of them would even have systems where you were simultaneously heating and cooling because no one cared about the energy consumption. It was the reliability that was uppermost in people's minds. So there needs to be a whole refresh of this data center design to find ways of minimizing the energy consumption there, because as I say, it's a huge load and one that we're probably not aware of at all in our daily lives. And this is just a bit of fun. It's a display on the side of a building in Beijing that's made up of both solar cells and LEDs. And during the daytime, the solar cells harvest electricity. It's stored in a battery. And at nighttime, you get a little art show on the facade, and it runs until the electricity runs out, and then the next day the cycle starts again. Okay, so one of the challenges has always been in the urban context: can you get enough energy harvested in a high-rise building to meet all of your needs? And the answer until recently was no. We did a research project with an architectural firm called Kish & Cathcart and Rutgers University, and started looking at various technological trends that include high-performance glazing and glazing that has selective coating so that it lets the daylight in and keeps out infrared and ultraviolet radiation. So it's that you can do on the facade to reduce solar heat gain while optimizing daylight. LEDs are becoming more and more efficient. So at the moment, commercial LEDs that you can buy are slightly more efficient than fluorescents, but if you look at the trajectory that they're on, by 2050, they're going to become very much more significant in terms of their efficiency. Similarly, in terms of means of generating electricity with the sun, photovoltaics, they're on a trajectory as well of increasing efficiency. So currently, you can get panels that are somewhere in the 14 to 18% range. So 14 to 18% of the solar energy is converted into electricity. By 2050, we expect that there'll be commercially available panels that are closer to the 25 to 30% range. So you put all of those technologies together into this hypothetical building, and what's interesting is that you can actually figure out, oh, by the way, I should just spend a moment on this one. This was the earlier version, which is awash with wind turbines, as you can see. And in the 2050 version of it, we got rid of them because in the meanwhile, we learned about all the problems of sticking wind turbines on buildings. Anyway, so it's a theoretical study, but as I say, the good conclusion coming out of it is that you can actually get to net zero even in the context of a high-rise building. And we did this study here to actually put it in the context of other tall buildings, obviously plucked from all over the place, just so that when we studied it, we didn't assume that there was no overshadowing from adjacent buildings. And even with a certain amount of overshadowing from adjacent buildings, given all these improvements in efficiency and technology, we can actually see a way to even high-rise buildings being net zero by 2050. It's not possible with today's technology, but things are moving in that direction. And just for a bit of fun, we also saw whether we could incorporate some kind of food production into this facility, which is actually an interesting thing to think about. A lot of our food is transported long distances, and one way of considering whether it's the right thing to do is to look at the calorific value of the food that's being transported versus the amount of energy that's actually consumed in the transportation. And you find that when you're transporting high calorie density foods like grain or sugar or things like that, it makes more sense than if you're transporting lettuce, right? So lettuce, tomatoes, these things have very low calorie content. They're mainly water. And so I would suggest that it's much more important to try and buy those water-heavy types of produce as locally as possible to avoid the transportation impact on carbon. Okay, so to conclude with this, you can see I like these spheres to give scale to different arguments. At the moment, if you took all of humanity and figured out the rate at which we're consuming energy, and sort of normalize it to be electricity. Yes, we're using energy of all sorts of different types, but we normalize it. You find that our continuous rate of energy consumption is at 15 terawatts. Now, the issue is that 1/3 of humanity has no access to modern sources of energy at all. They're still using firewood, animal dung, agricultural waste, and so on as sources of fuel. 1/3 of humanity has a kind of intermittent access to energy. It's not like us where you can flick the light switch and you have 99.999% chance that the lights are going to come on. There are places where the probability is a lot less than that, and there are regular power cuts and so on. And that's another 1/3 of humanity suffering that. And then there's a third like us. We're lucky to have full energy security and availability. Putting all of that together, the consumption is 15 terawatts. So if all of humanity actually had access to energy like we have, it's estimated that this number will go up to about 30 terawatts of consumption. Now then, the UN predicts that global population is going to increase from the 7 billion or so that we're at now up to 9, maybe even 10 billion. So you then say, well, for a world and they then say it'll stabilize at that point and start coming down. So for a world population of 10 billion, what does this number need to be? It's 45 terawatts. So 45 terawatts to give all of humanity at its peak size access to energy similar to what we have today. That's how much wind power is actually available if we were to go out and get it. That's how much solar power is actually available if we were to go out and get it. So there are technological challenges, not least amongst which is intermittency, that with a power station you can turn it up and down as your loads change. You can't do that with wind and solar, but all sorts of very intriguing battery technologies, storage technologies, and so on are being developed. So again, I feel confident that by the time we get to 2050, exploiting more of the natural sources of energy available to us is a distinct reality. And that's what we should all be pushing for right from now. Okay, so thank you.
Can we take some questions?
Absolutely, yeah.
Any questions?
Aha, the difficult question, right up front.
Actually,
at this school, and I appreciated the lecture as always, and the focus on net zero. At this school, the landscape section is leading the architecture section in their interest in environmental
Huh.
issues. And the way they're doing that is primarily through urban considerations. And I was wondering if in your office there are urban scale issues that complement your architecture issues.
Yeah.
Or do they approach the problem differently? Where is the landscape and the urban component of the same problem?
Right, if I perhaps didn't do my research enough, I was...
I'll ask that question rather than letting them ask the question.
No, sure. Right. I came prepared to talk to a room full of architects, and so focused on the buildings. But actually, on the way over here, I read up a little bit about the school, and it's okay, there's the landscape and there's the whole urban side of things that are two other wings, and I'm assuming that there are people in the audience that come from those backgrounds as well. I think looking at the city scale, particularly in the urban environment, is very, very important. And as I tried to show with that project, the Destiny project in Florida, you can make much bigger differences at the urban scale if you do things at that scale rather than leave it to the individual buildings to figure out their own issues. And the way in which that's addressed, I'm not an expert in this, so I wouldn't presume to be able to talk about the integrated planning work that we do. But we have groups of people. The strongest one is probably in London, but we have a group in Boston, we have a group in San Francisco, and so on, that they offer a service called integrated planning, which is not so much the aesthetic side of planning, it's much more the sort of performative side in terms of looking at transportation issues, looking at utility issues, looking at energy generation issues, food supply, dealing with waste, all of those things in a holistic way in the context of large-scale urban projects. And my own feeling is that the real breakthroughs in the future with regard to carbon emissions are going to come out of those kinds of processes rather than by just looking at individual buildings and trying to make them the best that they can be.
Would you find it interesting that it's still two separate disciplines, that there's still not a liaison between
Yeah, I do.
integrated planning and the net zero program? Or is that intrinsic to the nature of the two? I mean, it's what we've always.
Well, net zero as a principle cuts across all of this, including transportation. I think it's the practice of architecture and planning that tend to happen in two silos, and the more closely they're integrated, I think the better the results are going to be in the future.
You don't think putting trees on the top of buildings is really...
Sometimes, but not if they're getting in the way of the solar panels.
I have one more question.
Sure.
I want to take issue with your vicious and unprecedented and unsupported attack on fans.
Sorry, wind turbines.
The fans inside ceiling fans.
Yeah. I didn't attack them, I was plugging them.
They do mix the layer, so at least the temperature in the room remains constant, rather than allowing
Yeah.
layers of vapor.
Sorry, I was actually supporting the use of more fans, not...
You said they didn't lower the temperature in the room.
No, they don't lower the temperature in the room. They can actually raise the temperature in the room because you take the hot layers that are up at the top and actually mix them down into the cooler layers, so you have to be a little careful.
Make the room more reliably comfortable.
They can do that, yes, they can. Yeah. You win. Okay.
Other questions?
What norms within the built industry right now would you change in order to achieve net zero energy?
I think actually requiring it in the way that the Europeans are moving towards doing so. Of course, there'll be outcry from the commercial developer side of things, but for example, if you take the Cascadia branch of the US Green Building Council, they actually broke away from the whole LEED thing, and they've got, they're pursuing much higher, what is it called? I forget the name of the system, but Living Building Challenge, thank you. That's really talking about that. Say, we need to proactively go after this and actually develop buildings that and the good thing about it is it's not just about energy. They're actually looking at multiple aspects of the built environment to create places where people are going to be happy to be and that are healthy for people. But at the same time, one of the outcomes is that they're also pushing very hard on the net zero. Now, interestingly enough, there are very few buildings that have actually gone through that process to achieve certification. We're still with LEED, and I'm a supporter of LEED because I think LEED has driven a lot of improvement in practice, if you like. At least sustainability is now on the agenda, whereas 20 years ago it was nowhere near the agenda. Even 15 years ago it was rare that you had a building where it was on the agenda. But I don't think LEED is pushing hard enough. I don't think ASHRAE is pushing hard enough. So I think I made the point that really a lot of the advances in this area have come from policymakers and regulations rather than from the market deciding that something's a good idea. Mm.
I had an autobiographical question.
Sure.
Biographical question.
Biographical.
So, for someone who sort of started their career in the shadow of the oil embargo and
Yeah.
is now practicing in the sort of wave of global warming, what difference do you see between those two times when energy was trying to be or was sort of
Hmm.
design challenge or initiative?
Okay. Actually, the environments were quite different. Although some of the measures in terms of making buildings more energy efficient and so on are notionally the same, but at that time, immediately after the energy crisis, it was really all about reducing energy. And so that was the era where we got buildings that were glazed with heavily tinted glass, buildings that had highly reflective glazing on there. So if you were an occupant in one of these buildings, you could look out on a sunny day and it would still look as if it was overcast outside. It was horrible. I worked in a building like that. It really was very depressing to be there. And other changes came about. There hadn't been that much research on the amount of fresh air that people need within a building for ventilation purposes and so on. So there were various codes that were in place that, if you like, over-ventilated buildings. And once energy became an issue, people started looking at, well, can we cut down on the amount of ventilation? And in fact, there were studies that suggested that you could go down to 5 liters per second per person. That was done. And it was done at the same time as people were bringing in materials into the workplace that off-gassed volatile organic compounds, fabrics. So hopefully these aren't bad fabrics, but fabrics, foams, finishes on furniture and so on. So you have this combination of reducing fresh air supplies and increasing the off-gassing of materials within the space. And so you had this thing called the Monday morning effect. Now, we all hate Monday mornings, but this was actually physiologically, people would suffer more on a Monday morning with watery eyes, dry throat, etc., etc. And the reason was that the air conditioning was switched off on a Friday night to save energy. And throughout the weekend, all of these off-gassing materials would just fill the space with the VOCs. And then people come in on a Monday morning and there's a heavy concentration of these things in the air. So those kinds of things happened at that time because the focus was really on reducing energy at all costs. In fact, there was a residential project that we did. It was low-income housing where we actually had conversations on how can you make sure that the occupants of these buildings do not heat their bedrooms up above 65 degrees, right? How can you build that into the design? It was horrible, actually, with hindsight. I mean, we were all engaged on this mission to save energy, but the impact on human beings was not good at all. And I think that what is different now is that there is this more holistic consideration of these issues. The other thing is also, we weren't thinking about carbon at all at that time. It was really much more about oil is a limited resource, and it was much more about oil than anything else because there were projects where we actually substituted coal-fired boilers for oil as a means of reducing oil consumption. So nobody was thinking about carbon. That's really something that's come to the fore much more recently. So carbon is something that's come to the fore recently. The idea of sustainability being a holistic consideration of the whole experience of buildings and being in buildings and so on, and their impact much more widely on the environment. All of that, I think, is a much more enlightened place to be than it was back then. Sorry, long-winded answer.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.